Hello there, my name is Gabriel, and I would like to welcome you to Gender Identity for Dummies. I wanted to just simply use this podcast video to record the findings I have from my surveys, and just kind of to talk about my own experience with it as a whole. Before I want to address the problem, I want to go into what gender identity means to me, and just to go over like the introductory kind of survey questions I took. Because I got some I've never even heard of, or things that just I've never really heard of before. I got about 102 responses, which I thought was actually a lot more than I was expecting. So it was very cool to see. I'll be editing this video as I go along, so as I give my own definition, I'll put the proper ones up on the screen. So first off, a lot of my survey responses came from kind of my demographic group, from about 18 to 24. That was a majority of the responses. I had about 5 that were about 17 around then, and I had maybe about 4 that were 25 and up. It was pretty interesting that a lot of mine were a younger demographic. It was what I was expecting, so I'm very glad it turned out that way. First off, for the male responses, I got 31 that said they identified that way, and I got 39 responses that they were female, and I had about 15 responses that said they were non-binary. Non-binary means that they don't really fall into these two genders. Non-binary is a lot of an umbrella term that I'll get into as we go further down. As we move to these other responses, a lot of them really only had maybe about like 1 or 2 people say, because from what I've seen, male, female, and non-binary are like prominently the number 3 that most people choose to identify as. I had a few, about 2 responses that said they identified as gender fluid. Gender fluidity means that their gender isn't particularly fixed, and that it can change over time depending on how they choose to feel. It's something I haven't looked into much myself. I guess the thing that really confuses me is, when do people feel like they are one gender and when they are another? I guess I'm trying to find some understanding, but I guess it's more of a psychological thing rather than anything else. I had 2 responses that say they were transmasculine, which means that they were initially born as a female, however they switched to a male gender label. I have a transmasc friend in real life, so I thought that was actually pretty cool. I had about 2 responses say that they labeled themselves as demi-girl. From what I understand about demi-gender, is that it is only partially aligning herself with the 2 main gender binaries of male and female. It's one I actually don't hear about too often, so I'm pretty surprised that it was here. I had about 1 individual who labeled themselves as agender. So from what I've been able to understand about agender is that they don't fall into any gender at all. It's something I've never really heard of before, so it's interesting to see it here. I've never heard of this before, and I don't know anyone who labels themselves as this. I wonder how that works. Now, I don't know if you remember from previously when I was talking about non-binary being an umbrella term. So there are a bunch of smaller gender identities that fall into a non-binary label. Overall, it's more about stepping away from the 2 gender binaries of male and female and going into a different sort of take on your own gender. That's what like a non-binary umbrella term means. It's just from my own experience, that's what I've been able to understand. Well, besides that, that is really the end of our gender results. The rest of the responses overall just either didn't choose to share with me what they identified as, or they were just unlabeled, kind of like a non-binary type of thing. The main problem I wanted to address was how society, I believe, does not understand gender identity at all. I think gender identity is a very new and complex thing for people to understand nowadays, now that it's a lot more visible than ever. As we move on from the actual individual responses, we can move into ways we can solve this actual issue of how society doesn't really understand gender identity. You might be thinking, if we're simply more vocal about it and we speak to others about it, it would work. However, I don't think that's entirely guaranteed. When asked how comfortable people would be about talking about it, I had 60 people say that they would be very comfortable talking about it with people, and about 23 say they would only be slightly comfortable, which overall was a majority. So, with responses like these, why haven't we simply told other people and educated them about it? I think that if we're somehow vocal about it, it might lead to some misunderstandings about those who are a little bit confused. In my own personal experience, I've been told by a lot of people that opening up about your gender identity to others who don't really quite understand what that means is pretty difficult, and I feel as though that the other individual needs to also have some sort of understanding of what gender identity means. However, since they don't, it's very hard to educate them about that. I think it's overall a really confusing topic. In my surveys, I had about 87 responses that stated that they had encountered some misunderstandings about gender identity, either from strangers or friends or family. We can also pose the issue of whether the other person wants to understand at all. I think that some people are very adamant about the idea of there being only two genders in the world, which I don't really think makes them terrible people. We're all taught that growing up, and I think it'd be hard to get kind of out of that mindset, especially for older individuals. I had about 66 responses say that they themselves or someone they knew had been harassed for expressing their gender. So simply talking about it might not be entirely enough for some people, and could require a more in-depth discussion to kind of help ease them into this idea of gender identity. One solution that I think would help a lot is being educated on gender identity in educational settings. Schools, here in college, of course. When asked if they had ever learned about gender identity in formal education, I had about 77 out of the 102 responses say that they've never been taught about gender identity in high school or schools overall. I think that the reasoning behind this is, I think once again that gender identity has always been kind of a binary and never really an exploration of your own identity. If the majority of people, especially those running these education systems, think that there are only one male gender and one female gender, then they just see no point to educate it further. I think if we want gender identity to be better, widely understood, I think having it be at least a portion of the education system would help society better understand. Most responses about whether education would improve society's understanding agreed that it would help, while I had about 13 responses say that either it wouldn't do much or just wouldn't work at all. I think gender identity is an incredibly new thing for people to see in this world because of its newfound visibility. A lot of people are only just now being exposed to these ideas, and it's not just one specific demographic, it's pretty much everyone in the world. I've had classmates and stuff who are confused about this topic, and I've experienced some adults who are confused on this topic as well. So it's something that society doesn't fully understand and may really never come to understand, and these ideas are just pretty confusing to some people, and some may not accept it because they simply have a different worldview and they aren't accustomed to it. Education and opening up about gender identity may help others understand, but it's a process that will either take a really long time or it's just really not very gonna happen, at least fully. In my own life, I have struggled with my own gender identity for a long time now. I don't really think I know everything about gender identity, but I feel like I know enough to at least give a good basis on it. Um, in my own life, I personally haven't given myself a gender identity label. However, I know that I am at least somewhat female. I have never wanted to explain what my own gender is to my own close family, since I think that explaining gender identity to them would be pretty confusing. I am open to eventually opening up about that, about who I truly am, but I don't think I can do that yet until I have a full grasp on what I want to label myself as. One thing my family does know about me, though, is that I like to cross dress, and they are very accepting of that. I'm able to wear dresses and skirts and other clothes normally, like, designated for the female gender, and I'm able to wear them freely without prejudice. So, I'm very lucky to have a family who accepts that part of me, since I know a couple people who want to be able to dress the way they want to, but their family doesn't like those practices, so they are unable to. In the end, I think that gender identity is still a pretty new thing for people, and can be pretty confusing, honestly. I mean, even for people who do know, like me, I'm still learning about new things every once in a while, and I think it's pretty cool that people nowadays are able to express themselves in ways that I really never thought people would be able to do. But other than that, I had a lot of fun recording this and editing all of it. I had a pretty good time. I want to thank you for your time, and I hope to do more of these. I really enjoyed this process, and I love talking about things. I really do.